Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The dark hallways of the Ministry of Magic always felt different after hours. It was quieter, more foreboding, as though the silence was hiding things best left undisturbed. Harry Potter knew that feeling all too well, as he walked down the long, dimly lit corridor toward Hermione's office. He couldn't shake the sense that something had been off lately. Reports of strange magical disturbances had been piling up over the last few weeks, misfired spells, objects that seemed to act on their own, and an unusual number of wizards reporting vivid dreams about mirrors. Most of the reports had been dismissed as anomalies, but Harry knew better. After everything he'd been through in his life, he knew when something was more than just a coincidence. He pushed open the door to Hermione's office without knocking. She was used to his informal entrances by now, and as Minister of Magic, she was the only person who worked later than he did. Sure enough, she was bent over a large, dusty tome, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Harry," she said, not looking up. "You're late." "I didn't know we had a time set," he replied, dropping into the chair opposite her desk. "We didn't." "But you are still late." She finally looked up, giving him a tight smile. "I found something." Harry raised an eyebrow. "Good news, I hope," she sighed, closing the book with a heavy thud that sent a cloud of dust into the air. "Depends on how you look at it." "Do you remember hearing about the Mirror of Fate?" Harry leaned forward, his interest piqued. "No, a broken bar should I?" "It's an ancient magical artifact," Hermione began, folding her hands on the desk. "Legend has it that the mirror could show a wizard their true destiny. But it was more than just a reflection of the future. It could alter reality and bend fate to its will. The problem is, people got obsessed with it. They spent too much time looking into the mirror, trying to manipulate their destinies, and it ended up consuming them." "Consuming them how?" Harry asked, frowning. "Physically, mentally, magically. No one who used it for long survived with their sanity intact. The mirror feeds off desires and fears. The more you look, the deeper you fall into it. It twists reality until you can't tell what's real and what's a reflection." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. "And what does this have to do with the disturbances we've been seeing?" Hermione pushed the tome toward him, tapping the cover with a single finger. "Because the Mirror of Fate was supposedly destroyed centuries ago. Except now a broken bar, I'm not so sure. I found a record here in the Ministry archives, a very old one, that suggests the mirror wasn't destroyed. It was hidden." "Where?" Harry asked, his heart beginning to race. Hermione stood and walked over to a shelf behind her desk, pulling down a rolled up parchment. She spread it out on the desk, revealing a detailed map of the ministry. There, deep in the lower levels, was a room marked with a symbol Harry didn't recognize. "There," she said, pointing. "I think it's been locked away in a secret chamber, and I think it's been influencing the magical disturbances we've been seeing. The mirror is waking up, Harry. And if we don't stop hide a broken bar reality as we know it could start unraveling." Harry stared at the map, his mind racing. He thought he'd left behind the days of world-ending magical artifacts, but it seemed fate had other plans. He stood up, grabbing his wand from his belt. "Let's go," he said. Hermione nodded, and within minutes, they were making their way through the labyrinthine hallways of the ministry, descending deeper than Harry had ever been before. The air grew colder the further they went, and the torches lining the walls flickered with an eerie, bluish light. When they reached the door marked on the map, Harry paused. It was a massive stone slab, inscribed with ancient runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. There was no handle, no keyhole, and nothing that suggested it could be opened in any conventional way. "This is it," Hermione said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She raised her wand and began muttering an incantation Harry didn't recognize. The runes on the door glowed brighter, and with a low rumble, the stone slab slowly slid open, revealing a dark chamber beyond. Harry stepped inside first, his wand raised, casting a beam of light into the room. It was a small, circular chamber, lined with shelves filled with dusty scrolls and artifacts. But at the center of the room stood the mirror. It was taller than Harry, its frame made of dark, twisted metal that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy. The surface of the mirror itself was perfectly smooth, but as Harry stepped closer, he could see faint ripples moving across it, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a breeze. "That's it," Hermione whispered, her voice full of awe and fear. Harry stared at the mirror, unable to tear his eyes away. He saw his reflection staring back at him, but it was more than just a reflection. It felt a broken bar alive, as though the mirror was looking back at him, studying him, waiting. "What do we do with it?" Harry asked, his voice hoarse. "We need to seal it," Hermione replied, stepping up beside him. "Before it gains any more power. The longer it's left unchecked, the more it will start influencing the world around it." But as Hermione raised her wand to cast the sealing spell, something happened. The mirror's surface rippled violently, and Harry felt a strange pull, like an invisible hand was reaching out from the glass, tugging at him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hermione," he began, but it was too late. The mirror's surface shimmered, and in an instant, Harry was pulled inside. The world around him twisted and warped, and he felt as though he was falling through endless darkness. When he finally hit solid ground, he gasped for breath, his head spinning. He was no longer in the chamber. Harry looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was standing in what looked like the Ministry of Magic, but everything was wrong. The walls were warped, twisting and curving in impossible ways. Shadows flickered and danced across the floor, moving without any discernible source of light. And there were people here, but they weren't real. They were distorted, grotesque versions of the wizards and witches Harry knew. He saw a twisted version of Dumbledore, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes cold and unfeeling. Voldemort was there too, but he looked different, less monstrous, more human, and his smile was almost kind. Harry's heart raced as he realized where he was. The mirror world. He was inside the mirror. Harry, a broken bar. The voice made him whirl around, his wand at the ready. Standing behind him was a figure he hadn't seen in years. Sirius Black. But it wasn't the Sirius Harry remembered. This version of his godfather was pale and sickly, his eyes sunken and lifeless. "Sirius?" Harry whispered, his voice trembling. "Is it really you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move toward him, its movements slow and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Harry backed away, his mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the fear gnawing at his chest told him otherwise. He was trapped in a twisted reflection of his worst fears, his deepest regrets. And if he didn't find a way out, he would be consumed by it. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the warped corridors of the mirror world. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away from the twisted reflections of his past. But no matter how far he ran, the shadows seemed to follow him, creeping closer with every step. And then he saw him, Draco Malfoy. But this wasn't a reflection. Draco was real. "What are you doing here?" Harry gasped, stopping in his tracks. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. "I could ask you the same thing, Potter," Draco sneered, though there was a hint of fear in his eyes. "But we don't have time for that. The mirror, a broken bar, it's feeding off of us. We need to get out of here before it's too late." Harry nodded, his mind racing. He didn't trust Draco. He never had, but right now, they were both trapped in this nightmare together. They had no choice but to work together if they wanted to survive. "Do you know how to get out?" Harry asked, his voice tight. Draco's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked uncertain. "No," he admitted. "But I know this much. The mirror wants us to face our worst fears. It's feeding off our emotions, our doubts. The more we fight it, the stronger it gets." Harry swallowed hard. "So what do? "We confront it," Draco said, his voice steady. "We have to face whatever it throws at us. Only then can we break free." Harry stood still for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest as he processed Draco's words. The idea of confronting his worst fears wasn't new. He had faced them many times before, but the mirror world was different. This place didn't follow the rules of reality, and it was feeding off their very emotions. "All right," Harry said, tightening his grip on his wand. "Where do we start?" Draco glanced around, his eyes darting to the shifting shadows that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "We need to go deeper into the mirror world, to its heart. That's where it's strongest. If we can break it there, we can escape." Harry nodded, though the thought of going deeper into this twisted dimension filled him with dread. Still, there was no other choice. He followed Draco as they began to move through the distorted corridors of the mirror world, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The world around them seemed to warp with every step, the walls curving and twisting in unnatural ways. The ministry of magic that Harry knew was gone, replaced by a dark, surreal version of itself. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, and every so often, Harry thought he saw figures moving just out of sight, of figures that looked disturbingly familiar. As they walked, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and his heart pounded in his chest. He glanced over at Draco, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. "Do you feel it?" Harry asked quietly. Draco didn't look at him but gave a small nod. "Yeah, it's watching us. The mirror broken bar, it's alive in a way. It wants us to fail." Harry swallowed hard, pushing down the rising fear in his chest. They had to stay focused. They had to keep moving. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a vast, dark chamber. The walls seemed to stretch impossibly high, disappearing into shadow, and at the center of the room stood a single mirror. It was smaller than the one Harry had seen in the Ministry's chamber, but it pulsed with the same dark energy, its surface rippling like water. "Is that a broken bar?" Harry began, but Draco cut him off. "Number. It's a reflection of the real thing." "A trap." Before Harry could react, the mirror's surface shimmered, and figures began to step out of it. Harry's breath caught in his throat as he recognized them. Dumbledore, Voldemort, Snape, twisted versions of them, their faces warped with malevolence. They moved toward Harry and Draco with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Stand your ground," Draco hissed, raising his wand. Harry did the same, his mind racing. These weren't real. They couldn't be real. But the fear gnawing at his chest told him otherwise. The twisted reflection of Voldemort was the first to attack, raising his wand with a cold smile. Harry instinctively blocked the curse, the force of it sending him stumbling back. Draco was beside him, firing off spells at the reflection of Snape, who deflected them with ease. His lips curled into a cruel sneer. "This isn't working," Draco shouted, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're just feeding the mirror by fighting." Harry knew he was right. The mirror was feeding off their emotions, growing stronger with every spell they cast. But how were they supposed to confront their fears without fighting? Then it hit him. "We don't fight them," Harry said, lowering his wand. "We accept them." Draco looked at him like he was mad. "What?" "This place, yeah, it feeds off fear and resistance. If we stop fighting, we take away its power." Draco hesitated for a moment, his face contorted with doubt. But as the reflections closed in on them, he gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. But if this gets us killed, I'm blaming you." Harry didn't have time to respond. He turned to face the reflection of Voldemort, who was now just feet away. Harry took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to let go of the fear clawing at his insides. "You're not real," Harry said quietly, his voice steady. "You're just a reflection. You don't control me." The reflection of Voldemort paused, his glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, Harry thought he saw a flicker of doubt in those cold, red eyes. "I've already faced you," Harry continued, his heart pounding in his chest. "And I've beaten you. You don't have power over me anymore." The reflection snarled, but its form began to flicker, its edges blurring like smoke in the wind. Harry could feel the mirror world reacting, the very air around him vibrating with a strange, shifting energy. Draco, seeing what was happening, turned to face the reflection of Snape. He hesitated for a moment, then lowered his wand. "You were never my enemy," Draco said, his voice tight. "You were my teacher, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." Snape's reflection glared at Draco, but just like Voldemort's, it began to waver, its form distorting and flickering. The reflections of Dumbledore and the others followed suit, their twisted forms shimmering and fading as Harry and Draco refused to engage with them. Within moments, the chamber was empty once more, the dark, oppressive energy that had filled the room beginning to dissipate. Harry let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "It's working," he said, turning to Draco. "We're weakening it." Draco nodded, though he still looked wary. "We're not out of this yet. The mirror won't let us go that easily." Harry knew he was right. They had passed the first test, but the heart of the mirror world was still ahead, and it wouldn't give up without a fight. They continued forward, the air growing colder with each step. The further they went, the more twisted the world around them became. The walls bent and curved in impossible ways, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, almost tangible. Harry could feel the mirror's presence growing stronger, pressing in on them from all sides. Finally, they reached another chamber, even larger than the last. At its center stood the real mirror of fate, its dark surface pulsing with a strange, hypnotic light. This was Ida, the heart of the mirror world. As they approached, Harry could feel the pull of the mirror growing stronger, tugging at his very soul. His mind began to fill with images of flashes of his past, his future, his deepest fears and desires. He saw himself standing at the graves of his parents, alone and lost. He saw Voldemort rising again, stronger than ever. He saw himself growing old, watching as everyone he loved faded away. The images overwhelmed him, and for a moment, Harry felt himself slipping. But then he remembered what Draco had said, what they had both realized. The mirror fed on fear, on doubt. If he gave in, it would win. "No," Harry whispered, clenching his fists. "You don't control me." He stepped closer to the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. The images in the mirror shifted, becoming more intense, more vivid. But Harry refused to look away. He stared into the mirror, facing the fears it showed him head on. Behind him, Draco was doing the same, his face pale but determined. The air around them crackled with magic as the mirror fought back, trying to pull them into its depths. But Harry held his ground, his mind focused, his will unyielding. Finally, with a sound like shattering glass, the mirror's surface cracked. A web of fractures spread across the glass, and the entire chamber trembled as the mirror of fate began to fall apart. Harry felt the world around him shift, the darkness receding. He and Draco were being pulled out of the mirror world, back into reality. With one final crack, the mirror shattered completely, and everything went black. When Harry opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold stone floor of the Ministry's secret chamber. The mirror of fate was gone, reduced to a pile of glittering shards. Draco lay beside him, breathing heavily but alive. "We did it," Harry whispered, his voice hoarse. "We broke the mirror." Draco sat up slowly, wincing. "Yeah, broken bar we did." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they had just experienced settling over them. The mirror world was gone, but the memories of it lingered, the lessons they had learned etched into their minds. Finally, Harry stood, offering Draco a hand. "Let's get out of here." Draco hesitated for a moment, then took Harry's hand, pulling himself to his feet. Together, they walked out of the chamber, leaving the shattered remnants of the mirror of fate behind. The Ministry was quiet as they made their way back to the surface, the dark energy that had once filled its halls now gone. The world was safe again, for now. But Harry knew, deep down, that the mirror had changed him. It had forced him to confront parts of himself he had long buried, parts of his past that still haunted him. And while he had defeated the mirror, he knew that the battle against his own fears and doubts was far from over. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Harry looked up at the stars, his mind heavy with thoughts of what was to come.